Let's begin. So we'll start with meditation and we'll continue this meditation, this shamatha practice of resting in awareness. What I'd like to do is add something to it here. So yesterday, the resting in awareness practice, we introduced it with a quote from Padmasambhava, a great 8th century Indian master who actually brought Buddhism into Tibet. And so we'll use another quote from Padmasambhava to add to this practice a little bit. So I'll just read the quote and then I'll explain what he says. So he says, while steadily gazing in the space in front of you, so again with the eyes open in this practice, without meditating on anything, meaning not paying attention to any appearances, steadily concentrate your consciousness without wavering. Without wavering means not allowing yourself to get caught up in distractions. But then he says, alternate between observing who is concentrating inwardly and who is releasing. If it is the mind, ask, what is that very agent that releases the mind and concentrates the mind? And steadily observe yourself, then release again. By so doing, fine stillness will arise and you may even identify pristine awareness. So what he's doing here is he's introducing some questioning. And when we bring in questioning, then we've moved into Vipassana practice. Because in shamatha, we're not questioning, we're just observing. Once we start to question, then we move into Vipassana territory. So he's actually introducing a little bit of Vipassana here, but for the purpose of overcoming dullness and distraction, particularly dullness. Because if we are, say, resting in awareness, and we're falling into dullness, and then a question arises that asks us to investigate something, then of course we'll have to pay very close attention to do that investigation, thereby overcoming the dullness. And so that's why he says, by so doing, fine stillness will arise, because not only will it help us to overcome dullness, it'll help us to overcome any sort of distraction. Thereby stillness. We'll be able to rest in awareness if we're either getting dull or getting caught up in appearances. But he also says you may even identify pristine awareness. So that is really the nature of the mind. So therefore, by asking this question, not only is it helping us to overcome dullness and distraction as a shamatha, but also we can come to an insight into the nature of the mind. So what we are doing here in this practice is we're going to alternate shamatha and vipassana. So we're going to do the practice of resting in awareness. And here he talks about concentrating inwardly and releasing. So remember, we introduced the idea that if we're getting caught up in agitation, tension, distraction, we release the awareness into space. And if we get caught up into dullness, we sharpen the focus, we concentrate inwardly. So these are the two things we do to overcome dullness and distraction. And we'll do those again, but then we'll introduce a bit of questioning. And when the questioning is introduced, then we are to observe. We're not trying to intellectually answer the questions. We're just trying to see from our experience, investigate the question based on what we experience. So let's do that practice now and see what sorts of experiences we can have from doing this sort of approach to the practice, whether we find it helpful or not. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin by settling the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. So back straight and body completely relaxed. and keeping the body as still as possible. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then simply releasing all appearances and allowing the mind to come to rest. Simply resting in awareness. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. Not doing anything at all, simply resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. And if you notice any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower the gaze, release your awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Who is it that is releasing the awareness? Don't try to intellectually answer this. Just look. Look for the agent who's releasing awareness. And then relax again, simply resting in awareness. And if you notice you're falling into any dullness or drowsiness, then elevate the gaze and sharpen the focus. Concentrate the mind, knowing that you're aware. Who is concentrating the mind? Just look. And then relax again, resting in awareness. Who is resting in awareness? Is there an agent doing this? Look closely. Now release all investigation and just rest. Resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. In this session, we'll begin to look at these stages of progress, this 9-stage model, and then complete that in the next session. We'll look at the actual practice we're going to do in this session, which is this stillness in motion practice, which is actually the combination of the two practices that we've done so far, the observing thoughts and the resting in awareness practice. And we'll do a guided meditation on that. And as normal, time for question and answer at the end of the session. So as we saw in the previous session and earlier sessions, there are a number of different models used for shamatha. Here, in general, the classic 9-stage model is used. This is the one, the handouts that we have. But also here in this practice of observing thoughts, then often this 4-stage model is used to describe stages of progress. So what we see there is in the color diagram, the 9-stage model, that's the classic model. And this description for each of the 9 stages, various elements listed in that chart, but also you see in that chart, the last 2 columns of that chart is the 4-stage model. In fact, in this chart, that 4-stage model is divided up into 5 stages. So if you have that chart available, it might be handy to use as we go through the explanations. The color diagram you'll see in each of the slides, but the chart will be handy, although the information is on the slides, but you have a better overview on the chart. So as we saw also that we talk about moving through these 9 stages by abandoning the 5 faults with the 8 antidotes, relying on the 6 powers and these 4 mental engagements. So let's have a look at the beginning stages. So as we saw earlier, we have the meditator there, and the 2 tools we use in this practice. In the meditator's left hand is the rope of mindfulness, in the right hand, the hook of introspection. So they are the 2 main tools we use in shamatha. Then the elephant is symbolizing the mind. The black color of the elephant is symbolizing dullness or laxity. The monkey is symbolizing discursive thought in general. And the fact that it is black is symbolizing excitement, the most common form of distraction. As we saw in an earlier session yesterday, that the most common form of distraction is excitement or excitation, the so-called sense pleasures. So we saw that in the diagram, the 5 sense objects. And so what we see here at the first stage, which is called directed attention, the elephant and monkey are running wildly ahead of the meditator. So what we notice at the first stage of practice, of shamatha practice, is we notice that our mind is completely out of control and that we need to put a lot of effort to apply mindfulness to the object. And so that is what the flame is denoting. We see the flame on the side of the path, and as we wind up the path, going higher and higher, what we find is that the flame gets smaller and smaller, meaning that initially we have to put a lot of effort in mindfulness and introspection because they're not developed very well. But as we go further and further up the path, the flame gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually it disappears because at the highest levels, they're so well developed that it becomes a sort of effortless exercise to focus on the object. Now, what we achieve here at the first stage is that we can just hold the object maybe for a couple of seconds. So that's what it means by directed attention. If we can direct our attention to the object for a couple of seconds, then we've achieved the first stage. And the power by which we achieve the first stage is learning instructions, or in other words, hearing. That first, we hear about the instructions. We hear about shamatha practice from a teacher, or maybe even reading from a book, what to do, how to practice. We put those instructions into practice. We achieve the first stage. What problems persist at the first stage is there's no attentional continuity on the object, meaning that we can hardly focus on the object at all, that we are distracted for long periods of time. And so this is what happens at the first stage of progress. So when people start to do this shamatha practice and they sit down and they try to focus, say, on the breath, and then usually within a couple of seconds they get distracted and they go off on their stories for often for many minutes at a time. And then they go, well, hang on, I'm supposed to be on the breath. And they come back to the breath again for another couple of seconds. And then off they go again on another long story. And so when people have this experience, they often come to the conclusion, I can't meditate. I just can't meditate. In fact, I think I must be doing something wrong because my mind seems to be getting worse now. Before I started meditating, it was sort of okay, but now it's gone completely crazy. So I definitely can't meditate and I'm really doing something wrong. If this is your experience, you can meditate. In fact, you're making progress. You've made the first stage. So congratulations. Because if we've never sat down to meditate and focus on a single object, such as the breath, we may have this illusion that our mind is sort of okay, that, focusing on the breath, well, that can't be too difficult. I might get a bit distracted, but I should be able to do that okay. And then when we try to do it and find that we can hardly get on the object, that's the result. And so therefore that actually is progress. So the first stage of progress is simply noticing how chaotic and out of control our mind really is. So the main imbalance here is what's called coarse excitation. Coarse excitation is where we're completely distracted from the object. And so the mental engagement we need here at this stage is focused, meaning we need to put a lot of effort just to focus, keep focusing on the object, because most of the time we're distracted from the object. So the quality of our experience is movement, lots of thoughts going on in the mind. And so then we saw in that other 4-stage model, at the beginning stage, there's simply a waterfall of thoughts crashing down one after the other non-stop. So that is the first stage called directed attention. And if we keep putting effort into the practice, we'll go around the bend of the road to the next straight road. So the bend there is the power of reflecting or contemplation or thinking about the practice. Because if we think about the practice, understand it better, get more enthusiastic about the practice, we can get to the next stage of practice, go a bit deeper into the practice. Stage 2 here is called continuous attention. And so what we notice here is that the elephant and monkey are not running so fast anymore. And we have a little bit of white on the top of the elephant's head. That is symbolizing a little bit of stability and clarity, meaning now our mind is a little bit more stable on the object, meaning what we achieve at the second stage is we can hold the object for up to a minute or two. But what problems persist is that still most of the time we're distracted from the object. So when we get distracted, we tend to be distracted for long periods of time. So the main imbalance is still coarse excitation, completely distracted from the object. And so therefore the mental engagement again is focus. We need to put a lot of effort. So the flame we see is still very large here. We need to put a lot of effort to keep focusing on the object because most of the time we're still distracted. But we can at the second stage hold the object a little bit longer than we did at the first stage. So quality of experience is still one of movement, waterfall of thoughts crashing down on our mind. But if we continue to practice, we go around the next bend in the road, and that is symbolizing the power of mindfulness. So it's through improving our mindfulness that we move on to stage 3 and 4. Stage 3 here is called resurgent attention. And so what we notice here is that the rope of mindfulness is now tied to the elephant of the mind. So mindfulness is getting a lot better. So much so now that we can hold the object longer periods, maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the time. And now if we get distracted, we quickly come back to the object. Whereas earlier in the second stage, we tended to be distracted for long periods of time. Now we quickly recognize we're distracted and quickly come back. So that's what we achieve at the third stage. And that's symbolized by the elephant turning the head backwards, meaning we come back to the object very quickly if we get distracted. So what problems persist is we do still get distracted from the object completely, only for brief periods of time. So we still have the imbalance of coarse excitation, where we still do get occasionally distracted completely from the object, but only for brief periods of time. But now, since we're mostly on the object, now our mental engagement is what's called interrupted, that we're mainly focused on the object. Every now and again, we're interrupted by dullness or distraction, or interrupted by laxity and excitation are the technical terms. And then we see one other thing here at stage 3, and that is the rabbit. The rabbit on the back of the elephant. The rabbit is symbolizing subtle laxity or subtle dullness. And so from stage 3 onwards here, we need to start to pick up this subtle laxity or subtle dullness. Because if we don't start to distinguish these more subtle levels of dullness, we'll get stuck here. We won't be able to progress. Because at stage 3, we're focusing pretty well on the object. We're focusing 5 or 10 minutes at a time. If we get distracted, we quickly come back. So it seems like we are really gone a long way, and we must be actually getting pretty close to shamatha because our stability is getting very good. But the clarity still needs a lot of work. And so we need to start to pick up these more subtle levels of laxity and dullness from stage 3 onwards if we are to continue onto the higher stages. And so then, of course, the quality of experience still at stage 3 is one of movement, still lots of thoughts crashing down on our mind, but now they're not able to pull us away as much as they did in the earlier 2 stages. And so then we move on to stage 4, called close attention. So what we achieve now at stage 4 is that we can we never completely forget the object. We can hold the object the entire session without ever completely losing the object. Now, how long are we meditating? As we're going to see a little bit more later on, particularly on the last session, is that it's always recommended to have quality over quantity. Because in the beginning stages, if we try and meditate too long, we're not going to be able to sustain that. In the latter part of the meditation, we're simply going to get caught up in lots of dullness and lots of distraction. So for the latter part of meditation, we're actually increasing the very faults we're trying to decrease. So it doesn't help to try and meditate too long. So it's always recommended as a beginning stage, particularly the first 2 stages or so, to have many short sessions. Sometimes in the old meditation texts, they talk about meditating 1 Gatika. Now, in ancient India, they didn't have a system of measurement of hours, minutes, and seconds. In fact, they divided the day up into 60 units, and 1 unit of was called Gatika. So 1/60th of a day was 24 minutes. And so therefore, often in the text, it mentions as a beginner, it's probably good to meditate 1 Gatika. So somewhere in that ballpark figure to start with. But by the time we've got to stage 3 and stage 4, we're probably meditating at least double that. Because if we only ever meditate 15 or 20 minutes, then we won't be able to get very far in the shamatha. So as we start to particularly get into stages 3 and 4, we'll really need to start to increase the duration of our sessions. So for stage 4, we're probably meditating 45 minutes or even an hour in a session. And then we can go longer the higher we go in the shamatha, but always emphasizing quality over quantity. So even though now at stage 4, we can hold the object the entire session without ever completely losing it, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the quality of our attention. And I'll look at that shortly. And so the 2 imbalances here are what's called coarse laxity and medium excitation. And we'll look at the descriptions of those in the next slide, but just a couple other comments first. What persists at this 4th stage, what problem persists, is that there's some degree of complacency regarding samadhi, regarding this practice. Because by stage 4, we can hold in the object the entire session, maybe meditating an hour. And so we can get a little bit complacent, thinking, well, I never get distracted. I think I must be very close to shamatha now. And so we can get a bit of complacency in the practice. So that's a problem we need to overcome. And the mental engagement, again, is interrupted. We're still interrupted by various levels of laxity and excitation. But now the quality of our experience is a sense of achievement, that we really feel like we're no longer a beginner, that we're really making some significant progress in the shamatha practice. And now the amount of thoughts that are coming up in the mind is slowing down somewhat. So instead of a waterfall of thoughts now, it's more like a fast flowing river of thoughts going through the mind. So let's now have a look at these different levels of laxity and excitation, because these more subtle levels of laxity and excitation are what we need to deal with in the coming stages, stage 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth. So here we can talk about 3 levels of excitation or distraction and 3 levels of laxity or dullness. So as we've already seen, coarse excitation is where we're completely distracted from the object. Medium excitation is where we don't completely lose the object, but our mind is moving away from the object to some other distraction, but we're still a little bit in the corner of our mind holding the object. For example, let's say we're focusing on the breath and then we start to think about what we're going to have for dinner. And so we're mainly thinking about what we want to have for dinner, but a little bit in the corner of the mind, we're still noticing the breath. That's medium excitation. And then a more subtle level of excitation is where, for example, we are mainly focused on the breath, and a little bit in the back of our mind, we're thinking about what we want for dinner, but we're mainly focused on the object. So that's subtle excitation. 3 levels of laxity. Coarse laxity is where the mind is sinking. So it starts to mostly disengage. It's hardly on the object because it's sinking heavily. Of course, very coarse laxity is when we actually fall asleep in meditation. But coarse laxity is where sinking and we're barely noticing the object. Medium level of laxity is where the object appears. We're focusing on the object, but there's not much clarity or vividness there. Subtle laxity is where the object is actually very clear and vivid, but our attention is slightly slack. So we can see there are a number of levels of laxity and excitation that we have to overcome as we move through these middling stages. So let's have a look at the middling stages. So then if the next bend in the road is introspection. So now we achieve stage 5 and 6 through the power of introspection. So now introspection quality control is getting much better. We're more able to pick up more and more subtle levels of laxity and excitation. But before we go to stage 5 and 6, I just want to have a look at one part of the diagram here. You see on the left, there is a monkey in the tree, and there's some writing under the monkey there. And basically, that writing says that since virtuous thoughts at the time of shamatha meditation is a interruption, we need to stop them. At other times, it's not necessary. So what you will notice, particularly once we get into these middling stages and the mind starts to become more calm, more clear, more focused, then what you will notice is all these great ideas will start to pop up, these virtuous thoughts. Maybe there's a problem you've been thinking about for a long time, and then suddenly here comes the answer. So what this is saying is that if in the middle of shamatha practice, some great idea or solution to a problem comes up, that's not the time to entertain those thoughts. Is to simply acknowledge them and go, yes, I'll attend to that after the meditation, and go back to the practice. If you're worried about forgetting it, you can even have a little notepad next to where you meditate, jot down a few key words and go back to the practice. So that's what the monkey holding the fruit in the tree is symbolizing. So let's go to tamed attention, stage 5. So what we achieve now is we've overcome the complacency. So now we have a lot of satisfaction in samadhi, in concentration practice. But the problems persist is that we still have some resistance to the training. So even though we're taking a lot of satisfaction, there is still some resistance to doing this training or practice. Now the imbalances are medium laxity and medium excitation. So we've overcome that heavy level of laxity from stage 4. So we have a medium level of laxity now. Our mental engagement is still interrupted. It's interrupted by medium levels of laxity and excitation. The quality of our experience is, again, a sense of achievement, and the river flowing through a gorge. So still like a fast flowing river, similar to stage 4 in terms of the thoughts. And then we go to stage 6, which is called pacified attention. And now we've overcome that resistance to training. So we have no resistance to doing the training now. But what problems persist and what comes up here is desire, depression, lethargy, drowsiness. So they seem to be like quite heavy things. But what's happening here is what we saw a little bit earlier, we talked about earlier, is this idea of dredging the psyche. That as we go deeper into the practice, we really start to dredge those things deep within our mind that we've been consciously or subconsciously suppressing. So a lot of this stuff is coming up now. And so this is very common here around stage 6. A lot of these things are coming up. But now, because we've really developed well the ability to simply observe whatever's arising in the mind, these desire, depression, and so forth is not going to overwhelm us as they would at the earlier stages. Similar to lethargy and drowsiness, it wouldn't overwhelm us here as it would at the beginning of the training. But still, a lot of this stuff is coming up. We're dredging a lot. And as we saw earlier, the thing to do is when any of these things come up, simply observe them without hope and fear. Don't get caught up in them, and they will pass. So the imbalances we have here is now we've overcome that medium level of excitation. So we have subtle excitation, which means now we're focused mainly on the object, but a little bit of background noise still there, and medium laxity. So we're still not very vivid on the object. So we have to ramp up the clarity a little bit. And that's what we're doing in stage 7 coming up. So we're still interrupted by that medium laxity, subtle excitation, sense of achievement, but now the amount of mental content is really slowing down a lot. So now it's like a slow moving river of thoughts moving through the mind. And then we go around the next bend in the road, and this is the power of enthusiasm. So now our enthusiasm is really helping to move us to these higher levels of practice. We're very enthusiastic, and it's a power of enthusiasm that enables us to go on to stage 7, 8, and so forth. And stage 7 here is called fully pacified attention. So now what we achieve is all of that dredging that we did at stage 6, that's all been pacified now. That's all finished. And we do this through the power of enthusiasm. What problems persist is that we still have some subtle laxity, subtle excitation. We see that the monkey here, where we're just about to say goodbye to the monkey, but there's still a little bit there. And we see a little bit of black on the back of the elephant. So we have a little bit of subtle laxity, subtle excitation still there. So we still need to, but we can easily dispel them. A little bit of effort, we can dispel it. So the mental engagement is still interrupted a little bit by that subtle laxity and subtle excitation. Quality of experience is again one of familiarity. And again, the amount of mental events in the mind is really slowing down a lot now. There's not much movement in the mind at all. It's getting very close to becoming completely still. And that's what we find at stage 8, single pointed attention. Now our mind becomes completely still. And now we've completely eliminated even the most subtle level of laxity and subtle level of excitation. So what we achieve is that we can sustain samadhi or concentration single-pointedly for up to at least 3 hours without any subtle laxity, subtle excitation at all. But what we need to do is we need to still be on guard in case that were to arise. So that is still there. The impulses for subtle laxity and excitation are still lurking there, but we have a quality of stillness. So now the slow-moving river of thoughts is now emptied into a still lake or an ocean. The mind is completely still here. This is called single-pointed attention. And then we move to stage 9 called attentional balance. We see the meditator in the cave with the elephant of the mind lying next to the meditator. So what we achieve here is now that we have flawless samadhi, flawless concentration, long sustained for at least 4 hours, effortless, meaning that at stage 8, we needed to put a little bit of effort to begin the meditation, and then it would flow. But now it's effortless. We can effortlessly move into meditation and move out of meditation. It becomes completely effortless and spontaneous. The problems that persist is that attentional imbalances could reoccur in future. So if we were for some reason to completely stop practice here, then slowly those imbalances of laxity and excitation could return in the future. So the mental engagement now is completely effortless. We don't need to apply any effort because we're so familiar, so well trained in mindfulness introspection that we can flawlessly, effortlessly focus on the object for long periods of time. And the quality of experience here is said to be one of perfection. And here in this model, again, the mind is completely still, but here they use a different analogy than the ocean. They use the analogy of Mount Meru, the king of mountains, completely still, the mind. So this is stage 9. we still have not achieved shamatha, and we'll look at what we need to do to go from stage 9 to shamatha in the next session. So now I'd like to go to the practice for this session. And in this practice session, we are again combining the two practices we've done thus far. The first practice of observing thoughts, the second practice of resting in awareness. We're putting those together in a practice which I call stillness in motion. And again, we're using a quote from Dujung Limpa, as we did earlier with the observing thoughts practice. And this great 19th century Dzogchen master, and he says, loosely relax and watch your thoughts from afar, clearly observing whatever arises. So that's really describing the observing thoughts practice. He says that which observes is called mindfulness. That which is observed is called movement. And resting in that state is called stillness. So that's the resting in awareness. And then he says, identify them as such and meditate. Means distinguish stillness from movement and meditate. Meaning, whilst resting in stillness, observe the movements of the mind. And the movements here are thoughts, so mental events, not sensory events. So what is the advantages of this stillness in motion practice? So the observing the movement was the observing thoughts. So we have the same benefits as earlier of we'll become the masters of our mind. It'll very much a healing practice. The resting in stillness, like the resting in awareness, that the benefit of that is the open, spacious mind, the open, spacious stillness. And we can have that default mode in daily life of open, spacious stillness. And then when we combine the two, what an extra advantage we get is that we get an anchor for observing thoughts. Because many of you probably found when you were trying to observe the thoughts, it was very easy to get caught up in them and get swept away. Often because our mind is very tight and constricted. And so something comes up, we react to it. Whereas if we have this practice where we start off by resting in stillness, resting in that open, spacious mind, and then from that basis, that foundation, observe thoughts, then it's much easier to observe without contracting, without getting swept away. And also the other advantage with this practice is transition to daily life. Because in daily life, what we'd like to do is what's called open awareness, meaning to observe whatever's arising in front of us in daily life, mental and sensory. And so if we've done this stillness in motion practice here, we have this habit of resting in stillness, observing the movements of the mind, we can bring that more easily into daily life. So that's another benefit. And also, like the earlier two practices, this practice also very much a bridge into the Vipassana practice. So that's what we're going to do now. So just to summarize the practice again, like the two previous practices, the eyes open. So either partially or naturally open, resting your gaze. And again, you can elevate and lower the gaze if you find you're getting agitated or dull. So adjust the gaze accordingly. What we'll do in this practice is the first few minutes, we'll establish the foundation. So we'll start with resting in stillness, to just simply rest in awareness, to establish that foundation. Once we've established that foundation, then from that stillness, we'll start to observe the movements of the mind. Again, the movements, just the mental events. So we're not observing sensory events here. We're observing thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. Now, if you find that you're getting caught up a lot in distractions in your thoughts and emotions and so forth, then once again, go back into the stillness for a few minutes, establish the basis in stillness, and then again, once again, start to observe the movements of the mind. So that is like the anchor for this practice. So if you get caught up too much, go back to the anchor and then use that as the anchor point. So let's do that practice now. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin by establishing a good posture to put the body in a state so that it doesn't create any interferences in our meditation. So the back straight and the body relaxed. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And remember, in this practice, you can breathe through the nose or the mouth, whichever you prefer. And preparing the mind. Simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply resting in awareness itself. Knowing that you're aware. And just resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. Now, from that stillness, start to observe the movements of the mind. In other words, observing any thoughts, emotions, or other mental events arising in the mind. Without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of thoughts. If you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up in your thoughts, then go back and anchor yourself in stillness once again. So simply resting in stillness. And once you've established a foundation in stillness, then very gently start to notice the movements of the mind from that basis of stillness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So we've got some time for question answer now. So anyone has any questions, so either through the chat or switch on the webcam and the mic.
Glenn, this is Mikkel 1 from Copenhagen.
Mikkel 1, okay, as opposed to Mikkel 2.
Depends where you start counting.
Yes, exactly.
I have a question with regard to the progress on the stages. It seems that there is a limit to how far you can progress just by sitting on a daily basis, and at one point you need to go into more serious retreat. So I'm just wondering, like, where is that point, and what does it take to progress beyond that point?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's a little bit like the analogy, let's say you want to be a concert pianist. Will you get to become a concert pianist if you practice 30 minutes a day? Probably not. Can you get pretty good at playing piano with 30 minutes a day? Yeah, maybe, yes. So we need to sort of understand that. And that is also that, you know, often when people look at this sort of diagram, they get disheartened. They go, oh no, that's impossible. I can't do that, you know. But I think that would be a mistake. One is that sort of thinking has this sort of craving for some sort of result. So we need to let go of that. Because even if we can get a couple of stages along in the past, so even like stage 3, it's stage 3. I mean, we can focus on the object 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And if we get distracted, we quickly come back. So already at stage 3, our attention skills are dramatically better than normal, than average, than where we started. So already we are seeing a lot of benefit because of that in our life. So it's not like if I can't make it to shamatha, then it's a waste of time. So that's not the case. And as we're going to see a little bit in the last session, which I've already talked about a bit, is we need, and this comes in these prerequisites, which I've briefly mentioned already, is that we need to really have not only set up our life in such a way to be supportive of this sort of venture, but also we need to have a healthy worldview. Because if we don't have those things, then even if we put significant effort into this practice, we're not really going to get very far. I mean, it's a little bit like, for example, let's say we want to go to the gym and get fit, and we put some effort into that, but then the rest of the day we're drinking lots of beer and eating McDonald's. I mean, that's probably not going to, our gym work's probably not going to get very far with that sort of lifestyle, drinking lots of alcohol and eating junk food. So therefore, you know, when we look at these sorts of questions, then we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to not just go, well, how much effort can I put? How far can I get? We need to look at the bigger picture. It's like, what's my sort of lifestyle looking like? What is my sort of worldview? What are all these other factors which are going to make a big influence? So if we can look at all of those things, put those in order, then I think you'll find that you can make much better progress in this sort of practice, and it'll be much more effective, this practice, and it'll give greater benefit for us in our life. And then what will happen is that as we get into this practice and everything starts to shift and change and we start to receive benefit, you probably will find a lot of things will shift in our life in terms of priorities and other things. And then you may find that the conditions open up that weren't available now, but are available later. That means we can actually do significant more practice in terms of maybe doing a retreat and so forth. So what I'm suggesting is that we have that sort of bigger picture, and on that basis, then that will make it most effective in this practice. And then whatever effort we put in, we'll benefit from that. But the short answer to your question is that if we want to really get up through the middling and higher stages, and to expect to be able to do that on 30 minutes of meditation a day, I think that's completely unrealistic. It's like wanting to be a concert pianist with 30 minutes of practicing piano a day. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Okay.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, maybe a chat and then we'll go back to the video.
Okay.
So one chat, one video will oscillate. So a chat question?
Yeah, so there's a question from Hyasung and saying, I'm not good at the resting in stillness.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, do I need to develop the resting in stillness first, or do I need to go ahead with the combined practice? Thank you.
So I didn't quite catch the problem. They find it difficult to rest in awareness, and so should they do what? I didn't quite catch the question.
Should they continue with resting in stillness before they go ahead with the combined practice?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we did the observing the thoughts practice without consciously doing the resting in stillness. So we can just do the observing thoughts practice as we did yesterday. And in terms of the resting in stillness, we introduced one thing we can do to help anchor ourselves a little bit already, and that is to anchor ourselves in the rhythm of the breath. So I think that, yes, it would be helpful to, if we want to do the sort of the combined practice, then to spend a little bit of time on just resting in awareness practice and using those short-term strategies that we mentioned a little bit yesterday in terms of helping us to get into that resting in awareness practice. So we can do that, and then we can go into the stillness in motion, or we can just do the observing thoughts practice as well.
So next is Tamsin, because she unmuted herself at the same time as Mikkel. And
Okay.
then we'll have a chat question, and then it will go to Murvi.
Okay. Hi, Tamsin.
Thanks, Martina. Hi, Glenn. Wonderful to be doing this with you. Really enjoying it. My question was around during the resting in awareness, resting in stillness and motion practices, I find that I have to bring in some labeling to help me stay on track. And is that okay? I'll have like this kind of, I'll be in awareness, and then I'll kind of say, I am aware to myself to just help me kind of tune into that. And then when I notice I've become distracted, I'll go, oops, distracted, anchor back in stillness. And there's slightly like a bit of an ongoing commentary going on. And I was just wondering, is that?
Sure. Yeah, very good question, very good point. And this is something relevant to, I think, all practices, not just shamatha, is that when we are learning these practices, then we're not that familiar with all the aspects of the practice. Then not only is it helpful, but often it's necessary to do a little bit of commentary, internal commentary, like, you know, oh, I'm distracted, I'm this, I'm that. So as a beginning phase, don't be worried about a little bit of commentary. In fact, it can be very, very helpful, as you've mentioned, but to be a little bit careful that we don't turn commentary into some elaborate thing. So minimal commentary to keep us on track is helpful and important. And then once we start to get more into the practice and become more familiar with the practice, then we won't need that commentary. For example, we brought in the commentary earlier yesterday of, you know, if we get distracted, relax, release, return. And if we get dull, refresh, restore, retain. So that's commentary. But that little bit of keyword commentary in the initial phases to remind us what to do is helpful and useful. So that's good. So bring it in when needed and use it. And what you mentioned there in terms of, and that's something I'll introduce a little bit more in the next session, is a few more backup strategies in terms of the stillness in motion. And one backup strategy, which I think you mentioned there, is that to help avoid getting swept away in our thoughts, we can do a little bit like earlier in the observing thoughts practice from yesterday. And that is, whilst we're resting in stillness, and this is something we'll bring in next session as well, is just very lightly noting the mental events. So you're sort of mainly hanging out in stillness, that's sort of the main focus. And then just a little bit sort of off in the distance, if something comes up, you may give it a little bit of labeling going, oh, thought, oh, frustration, oh, image, memory. So that can be also very helpful to get in. And that's what we're going to also bring in the next session, a little bit of fine tuning on that. So the sort of the bottom line then is, again, in the initial phases, a little bit of commentary is helpful and useful to get into the practice and use it when necessary. And then slowly let go of that commentary, because eventually that commentary, which is beneficial and helpful initially, will just become another distraction. But as long as it's helpful at the beginning, use it, and then eventually just let it go and stay with the practice. Okay?
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you.
Sure. So I think, was there one more chat question then?
There's a chat question, and then there's Mervi in queue next. However, it's 12 o'clock. So I'm just...
So it's okay. We can, I'll quickly answer them. I think we've got an hour for lunch.
So Pamela's question, medium laxity seems to be a problem for me when the object is the breath, but not at all when the object is the mind. Should I continue with the breath to develop my clarity, or just stay with the mind as an object, since my practice is better with that?
Yeah. Again, the general recommendation is to use the object that works best for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean the one that you initially find easiest. Because let's say you find the breath easier than focusing on the mind, but in the breath practice, you're not very enthusiastic about it. In fact, you find it a little bit boring, then you're not going to get very far in the breath practice. Whereas maybe you find the mind practice more challenging, but you're much more enthusiastic about it, then maybe that's going to be the better object for you. So we need that enthusiasm for the practice. So I think that's the one we should go for, the one that we feel most enthusiastic about. Okay, and then Mervi, last question.
Yes. Hello, Glenn.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very
Sure.
quick question, so everybody can go and have their lunch. It's actually related to the first question that was asked about, this daily practice. I was thinking that I'm very much beginner in all of this, and I was thinking that, is there any particular, this retreat, what we are doing with you is great, but is there also other retreats you would recommend for the beginners to get really like, completely leave home and focus on this thing? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, in fact, this is part of a series of 5 retreats, because what I find is that these 5 retreats I'm doing really cover a lot of the core elements of practice in terms of the basis of here in shamatha, a calm, clear mind, and on that basis, the 2 main wings of wisdom and compassion. So I think in terms of a balanced food groups, I think these 3 core areas of practice work very well together. And if we can work on those sort of together, we can get the most benefit. So if we want a healthy diet, then I think these 3 elements of shamatha, of wisdom and compassion, we can't go astray. And so that's why I'm doing these 5 retreats. Okay. Okay, let's leave it there for now for a break for lunch. So we'll come back in an hour.